My son said I was no longer family. Then the lawyer put this on the table. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. Thank you very much. Now, let us go back to our main character, Margaret Whitmore. You're not my family anymore, Mom. Sign the papers and get out of the house. Daniel Whitmore's voice struck the polished conference room with enough force to stop even the quiet ticking of the brass clock on the wall. Across the long walnut table, Margaret Whitmore sat perfectly still. 67 years old, silver threaded through her carefully brushed hair, she wore a simple navy cardigan and the pearl earrings her late husband, Richard, had given her on their 30th anniversary. She did not look angry. She did not look frightened. She simply looked at the son she had raised and wondered when he had learned to speak to her like a stranger. Daniel pushed a thin stack of documents across the table. The pages slid toward Margaret and stopped inches from her folded hands. Sign them, he repeated. Beside him, his wife, Claire, adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored blazer and avoided Margaret's eyes. At the far end of the room sat Rebecca Sloane, the Whitmore family attorney for nearly 20 years. Rebecca had been silent through most of Daniel's speech, but now she slowly removed her glasses. Daniel, she said, I strongly suggest you don't ask her to sign that. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. Rebecca, this is a family matter. Rebecca's expression did not change. That is precisely why I'm warning you. Margaret finally lowered her eyes to the documents. She did not touch them. 3 days had passed since Richard Whitmore had been laid to rest beneath an old maple tree outside Columbus, Ohio. 3 days since Margaret had stood beside Daniel at the funeral and held his hand while he stared at his father's casket. 3 days. Somehow, grief had already become paperwork. Daniel leaned back in his chair. At 41, he carried his father's sharp jaw and confident posture, but this morning there was something else in his face, something Margaret barely recognized. Certainty. Not the certainty of a grieving son, but of a man convinced the room already belonged to him. Dad is gone, Daniel said. Things have to change. Margaret looked at him. Things? The house. The company. The accounts. Everything. Claire finally spoke. Margaret, nobody is trying to hurt you. We're trying to make this transition easier. Margaret's gaze moved toward her. By asking me to leave my home? Claire shifted in her chair. Daniel answered instead. It's too much house for one person. 5 bedrooms, nearly 6,000 square feet. You don't need it. Need. Margaret let the word settle. 42 years in that house reduced to a calculation of square footage. Christmas mornings. Daniel's first steps across the kitchen floor. Richard burning pancakes every anniversary because cooking had never been his gift. All of it suddenly summarized by what she supposedly needed. And where exactly would I go? She asked. Daniel exhaled impatiently. Claire found a very nice retirement community outside Dublin. You'd have everything taken care of. For the first time, Rebecca looked sharply at him. Margaret noticed. Daniel did not. You already chose a place for me? Margaret asked. We're planning ahead. Before your father's estate has even been fully discussed? Daniel's jaw tightened. Dad always said the company would come to me. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Did he? You know he did. Margaret studied her son for another quiet second. Then she looked toward Rebecca. Something unspoken passed between the two women. Rebecca placed one hand on the closed leather portfolio beside her. Daniel noticed the movement. What's that? He asked. Rebecca did not answer immediately. Margaret looked back at the unsigned papers in front of her. Daniel, she said softly, are you certain you understand what your father left behind? His smile returned, confident and dismissive. I understand exactly what belongs to me. Rebecca's fingers rested on the portfolio. Margaret's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not into anger. Into recognition. Her son had walked into this room believing today was about removing his mother from a house. He had no idea that Richard had spent years preparing for this exact conversation. Daniel had arrived at Rebecca Sloane's office 45 minutes before Margaret that morning, and he had not come alone. Claire had been beside him, carrying a leather folder filled with property listings, financial estimates, and information about retirement communities she had researched before Richard was even buried. By the time Margaret walked through the door, Daniel had already spoken as though the future had been settled. He wanted the Whitmore house prepared for sale before the end of the month. He wanted access to Richard's corporate records. He wanted a meeting with the board of Whitmore Manufacturing by Friday. Most of all, he wanted everything handled quickly. Rebecca had listened without agreeing to a single request. Now, sitting across from him, Margaret finally understood why Rebecca had looked so troubled when she entered the room. How long have you been planning this? Margaret asked. Daniel frowned. Planning what? My new life. Claire glanced toward him, but Daniel answered without hesitation. Someone had to think practically. Margaret looked down at the documents again. Your father has been gone for 3 days. And the world did not stop 3 days ago. The words came quickly, almost casually. Rebecca's eyes hardened. Margaret remained quiet. Daniel mistook that silence for surrender. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Columbus, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal jacket. Dad spent 38 years building Whitmore Manufacturing. There are employees waiting for direction. There are contracts that need decisions. There is a board that needs leadership. And you believe that leadership is you, Margaret said. Daniel turned. Of course it is. Because? His expression tightened. Because I am his son. Margaret held his gaze. There it was. Not experience. Not preparation. Not sacrifice. Blood, interpreted as entitlement. Daniel returned to the table. Dad brought me into the company 15 years ago. He taught me the business. He gave you opportunities, Margaret corrected gently. Daniel laughed under his breath. There is always a correction with you. Only when the truth needs one. Claire shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca remained silent, one hand still resting near the leather portfolio. Daniel pulled out his chair but did not sit. This is exactly why the house situation needs to be resolved. You are emotional right now. Margaret's eyes lifted. Emotional? You just lost your husband. Nobody expects you to make major decisions. Yet you brought me documents requiring my signature. The room went still. Claire looked down. Rebecca's mouth tightened as if suppressing a response. Daniel paused only briefly. Those documents simplify things. For whom? Margaret asked. Daniel did not answer. Margaret remembered another conference table nearly 30 years earlier, when Whitmore Manufacturing had been 6 weeks from missing payroll. Daniel had been a boy then, more interested in baseball cards than balance sheets. Richard had come home one evening carrying numbers that frightened him. Margaret had listened until midnight, then quietly made a decision that changed their lives. Daniel knew none of that. Richard had insisted their children should never carry the weight of those desperate years. Margaret had agreed. Perhaps they had protected Daniel too well. You think your father built everything alone, she said. Daniel shrugged. He founded the company. Rebecca looked at Margaret, but Margaret gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. Daniel continued, unaware. You supported him. Nobody is denying that. But supporting someone and building a company are not the same thing. Margaret absorbed the sentence without blinking. Claire reached for her water but did not drink. Rebecca slowly closed the file she had been reviewing. Daniel, she said, you should be very careful about assumptions concerning the history of Whitmore Manufacturing. He gave her an irritated glance. I know my own family history. Margaret almost smiled, but there was no amusement in it. Do you? Daniel leaned forward. What is that supposed to mean? Margaret looked at the man her son had become, then at the papers intended to remove her from the home where she had spent most of her adult life. It means there are things your father and I chose not to burden you with. Daniel shook his head. This is not the time for old stories. Rebecca's voice came quietly from the other end of the table. Actually, Daniel, before this meeting is over, I think you are going to discover that the old story is the only reason there is anything here for you to inherit. Rebecca's words changed the temperature in the room. Daniel stared at her for a moment, then gave a dismissive laugh, as though she had offered him an interesting piece of family trivia instead of a warning. I appreciate the history lesson, Rebecca, but I have worked at Whitmore Manufacturing for 15 years. And your mother was there before the company had enough money to hire its first employee, Rebecca replied. Daniel turned toward Margaret. What does that mean? Margaret studied him quietly. She could have answered. She could have told him about the winter when Richard worked from a rented office barely larger than their first apartment bedroom. She could have told him about evenings spent at their kitchen table, invoices spread between dinner plates while she calculated which bills could wait another week. Instead, she said, it means you should listen before you decide what belongs to whom. Daniel pulled his chair back and finally Saturday, fine. Then let us stop talking around it. Dad ran the company. Everyone knows that. Margaret's expression remained calm. Everyone knows the version he allowed them to see. Claire looked between them. Margaret, Daniel is not trying to erase what you did for Richard. Margaret turned toward her. Is that not exactly what is happening? Claire fell silent. Daniel rubbed his forehead impatiently. Mom, you stayed home for most of my childhood. There is nothing wrong with that. You raised me. You supported Dad. But now you are acting as though you were sitting beside him in every board meeting. No, Margaret said. I am telling you that a boardroom is not the only place where a company is built. Daniel leaned back. There it is again. Another sentimental story. That sentence landed differently. Margaret remembered Daniel at 8 years old, asleep on the couch while she worked through supplier invoices after midnight. She remembered selling the small lake property her parents had left her because Richard needed capital to keep the business alive. She remembered taking accounting courses at a community college so she could manage the company books when hiring a controller was impossible. Richard had promised her that sacrifice would never be forgotten. Margaret had never imagined her own son would be the one to forget it without ever knowing it. You believe I was simply waiting at home while your father built your future, she said. Daniel sighed. I did not say simply. You did not have to. Rebecca opened a legal pad. Daniel, we need to return to the purpose of this meeting. Good, he said. Then let us discuss the estate. We will, Rebecca replied. But first, remove those papers from in front of your mother. Daniel looked at the documents he had pushed across the table. They are straightforward. Rebecca's tone sharpened. They ask Margaret to surrender her occupancy rights and consent to a future sale of the residence before you have established that you possess any authority to request either. Claire's face changed. Daniel told me the house would pass to him. Rebecca looked directly at Daniel. Daniel has not heard the estate documents yet. Daniel's confidence flickered, but only for a second. Dad told me the house would stay in the family. Margaret spoke softly. I am family. Daniel looked at her, and the irritation in his face hardened into something colder. That is not what I meant. Silence followed. Margaret's fingers tightened once, then relaxed. Rebecca watched Daniel carefully. Claire stared at the tabletop. Daniel continued, apparently unable to recognize the line he was approaching. The house should belong to the next generation. Claire and I can use it. We can maintain it. You cannot honestly expect to live there alone for the next 20 years. You already decided how long I am allowed to live in my own home? Margaret asked. That is not what I said. Then tell me what you are saying. Daniel pushed the papers toward her again. I am saying sign them, let us sell the house, and stop making this harder than it needs to be. Margaret did not touch the pen. And if I refuse? Daniel looked directly into his mother's eyes. Then maybe you need to decide whether you actually want to be part of this family anymore. Rebecca immediately closed her legal pad. Daniel. But Margaret raised one hand. Her face held no anger now, only a sadness so controlled it made Claire look away. No, Rebecca, Margaret said. Let him finish. Daniel swallowed, but pride carried him forward. I am trying to protect what Dad built. Margaret nodded slowly. Then before you ask me to disappear from it, perhaps you should find out who helped him build it. Rebecca reached toward the leather portfolio beside her, but Margaret gave her another small glance. Not yet. Daniel still believed the greatest surprise waiting in that room was the reading of his father's will. He had no idea that the will was only the smallest piece of what Richard Whitmore had left behind. Rebecca did not open the leather portfolio. Instead, she reached for a cream-colored envelope that had been waiting beneath her legal pad since Margaret entered the room. Daniel noticed immediately. His posture straightened. Claire moved her chair slightly closer to him. Margaret remained still. Now we can discuss your father's will, Rebecca said. Daniel's expression changed almost instantly. The irritation softened. Confidence returned. This was the part he understood. Richard Whitmore had spent nearly 4 decades turning a struggling industrial supply business into a respected manufacturing company with facilities across Ohio and Indiana. Daniel had grown up hearing that one day he would carry the Whitmore name forward. In his mind, this meeting was simply where that promise became official. Rebecca removed several pages from the envelope and began reading. Richard had left Daniel his personal collection of classic automobiles, several investment accounts, and a substantial cash inheritance. Daniel listened without interrupting. With every asset named, his shoulders seemed to relax. Claire reached beneath the table and quietly touched his hand. Margaret saw it. She also saw the brief smile Daniel tried to hide. Rebecca continued. Certain personal belongings would pass to Margaret. Richard's watches, letters, photographs, and several pieces of furniture he had specifically identified would remain with his wife. Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment when Rebecca mentioned Richard's old walnut writing desk. He had written his first business plan at that desk. Daniel barely reacted. Then Rebecca read that Margaret retained the right to occupy the Whitmore residence under provisions governing Richard's estate. Daniel leaned forward. Right to occupy, he repeated. That does not mean ownership. Rebecca looked over the top of the page. I am reading the document, Daniel. I understand. I am only clarifying. Then allow me to finish before you clarify anything. Claire looked uncomfortable, but Daniel leaned back with a faint smile. To him, the language sounded temporary. A right to live somewhere was not the same as controlling it. He was already calculating what came next. And the company? He asked. Rebecca placed the will on the table. The will does not transfer controlling ownership of Whitmore Manufacturing to you. The smile disappeared. What does that mean? Exactly what I said. Daniel stared at her. Dad told me I would inherit his interest. You have inherited what Richard personally owned at the time of his death and what was governed by this will. That sounds like lawyer language. It is lawyer language because we are in a law office discussing legal documents. Margaret almost smiled. Daniel did not. So what percentage do I get? He asked. Rebecca folded her hands. Through the probate estate, far less than you appear to expect. Claire turned toward Daniel. You said it was most of the company. It is, Daniel insisted. Dad controlled Whitmore. Margaret finally spoke. Your father controlled many things. That does not mean he personally owned everything he controlled. Daniel looked at her with growing suspicion. What are you talking about? Margaret did not answer. Rebecca continued through the remaining provisions. Daniel received enough money to make most people grateful for the rest of their lives, yet gratitude never appeared on his face. He was listening for only two things, the house and the company. When neither arrived in the form he expected, impatience returned. There must be another document, he said. Rebecca gathered the pages neatly. There are several. Daniel looked relieved. Good. Then let us get to those. Rebecca glanced at Margaret before speaking. Not yet. Why not? Because there is something else we need to address first. Daniel looked at the unsigned papers still sitting before his mother. He picked them up, turned them around, and slid them toward her once more. Fine. We can handle the rest afterward. Mom, sign this so we can at least settle the house. Margaret looked down at the signature line. You just heard Rebecca say you do not have the authority you assumed you had. She said you have occupancy rights. I am offering you a clean solution. Claire found a community 20 minutes away. You would have your own apartment, meals, transportation, everything. And you would have the house. Daniel exhaled. Eventually, yes. Margaret looked toward Claire. Did you choose the real estate agent too? Claire hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Margaret turned back to Daniel. You planned the sale before your father's funeral. I planned for reality. No, Margaret said quietly. You planned for my absence. Daniel's face tightened. Why do you always make everything personal? Margaret stared at him. You are asking your mother to surrender her home 3 days after burying her husband. What part of that would you like me to consider impersonal? Daniel pushed the pen closer. Just sign it. Margaret moved the pen back toward him with one finger. No, the answer was quiet, but absolute. Daniel's patience finally cracked. Then stop acting like everyone owes you something because you were married to Dad. Rebecca immediately said his name, but Daniel continued. He built the company. He created this life. You benefited from it. And now you are standing in the way of the people who are supposed to carry it forward. Margaret's eyes held his. The people? Claire and me. The next generation. The family. Margaret waited one beat. And what am I? Daniel looked at the papers, then at his mother. Pride answered before wisdom could stop him. If you are going to fight us over everything, then maybe you are choosing not to be part of this family anymore. Silence filled the room. Claire went pale. Rebecca slowly removed her glasses. Margaret looked at her son for several long seconds, then turned toward Rebecca and asked only one question. Is there anything else Daniel needs to see before I answer that? Rebecca looked toward the closed leather portfolio beside her. Yes, she said. There is. Rebecca did not reach for the portfolio immediately. For several seconds, nobody moved. Margaret could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system above them and the distant sound of a telephone ringing somewhere beyond the conference room door. Daniel had said the words, and now they seemed to remain in the room between mother and son, too heavy to take back. Claire finally broke the silence. Daniel, you did not mean that. He looked toward his wife, then back at Margaret. Pride held him in place. I meant that family has responsibilities. Margaret nodded slowly. Responsibilities. The word carried her backward almost 35 years, to a small kitchen table in a rented 2-bedroom house outside Columbus. Richard had been 34 then, exhausted and frightened, with a yellow legal pad covered in numbers. Whitmore Manufacturing was not yet a company anyone recognized. It was 3 employees, 2 aging machines, 1 unreliable delivery truck, and more bills than cash. Richard had stared at those numbers and told Margaret he might have to close. She had listened quietly, then walked upstairs and returned with a folder containing documents for 12 acres of land near Dayton that her parents had left her. Richard had refused at first. Margaret had insisted. The property was sold. The money kept payroll moving, paid suppliers, and gave Richard enough breathing room to secure the contract that changed everything. Years later, when the company expanded, Margaret took evening accounting classes while Daniel slept at his grandmother's house twice a week. She managed invoices, reviewed contracts, and sat beside Richard through decisions nobody outside their marriage ever saw. When success finally came, Richard became the public face because Margaret preferred it that way. She wanted Daniel to have a childhood, not a front-row seat to every financial crisis his parents survived. Now that same child sat across from her speaking as though she had merely occupied the comfortable life Richard created. "Do you remember your 10th birthday?" Margaret asked. Daniel frowned at the unexpected question. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Your father missed the first hour of your party." Daniel shrugged. "He was working." "Yes. He was trying to save a contract worth almost $2 million. Do you remember who stayed?" Daniel looked irritated. "You did. Do you remember who finished the financial projections he took into that meeting?" Daniel said nothing. Margaret continued. "Do you remember when the company nearly lost its main supplier when you were 14? "Mom, I was 14. "Exactly. You were 14. We protected you from knowing how close everything came to disappearing." Rebecca watched Margaret carefully. Claire had stopped touching Daniel's hand. "Your father and I made a choice," Margaret said. "We decided you would grow up knowing security instead of fear." Apparently, somewhere along the way, security began to look like entitlement. Daniel's face reddened with embarrassment. "So this is what we are doing now? Listing everything you ever did for me?" "No. I have never needed you to repay me for being your mother." Her voice stayed soft. "But I will not allow you to rewrite my life simply because the truth interferes with the future you planned for yourself." Daniel pushed back from the table. "I am not rewriting anything. Dad was the founder. His name is on the building." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Our name is on the building. You know what I mean." "Yes," she said. "I finally do." Claire tried to soften the moment. "Maybe everyone is grieving. Maybe we should postpone this." Daniel shook his head immediately. "No. We finish today." He turned toward Margaret. "Sign the occupancy release. We sell the house. You move somewhere manageable. Then Rebecca can finish explaining the company documents." Margaret looked at the pen again. "And if I still refuse?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then do not expect me to keep pretending everything between us is normal." "Normal?" Margaret asked. "You are forcing everyone to choose sides." "There are no sides, Daniel. There is only a document you want me to sign and my answer." "Then say it." Margaret pushed the papers back across the walnut table. "No," Daniel stared at them. "Then I meant what I said. If you are going to stand against Claire and me, do not expect us to treat you like family." Claire whispered his name, but Margaret raised her eyes before she could continue. Something inside Margaret had gone quiet. Not broken. Settled. She remembered Richard sitting beside her 6 months earlier in their sunroom, his health already failing, asking a question that had seemed strange at the time. "What happens, Maggie, if Daniel mistakes inheritance for authority?" Margaret had defended their son. Richard had simply taken her hand and said he hoped she was right. Now she understood why he had asked. Margaret turned toward Rebecca. "Richard expected this possibility, did he not?" Rebecca's expression softened. "He hoped it would never happen. But he prepared for it." "Yes." Daniel looked between them. "Prepared for what?" Margaret did not answer him. She looked at Rebecca and gave a single nod. "It is time." Rebecca stood, walked to a locked cabinet built into the wall behind her desk, entered a code, and removed a thick red leather binder. She returned to the conference table carrying it with both hands. Daniel's confidence faded as his eyes followed it. Rebecca placed the binder directly between him and Margaret. Embossed across its cover were 4 words Daniel had never seen before: Whitmore Family Trust. Daniel stared at the red leather binder as though 4 ordinary words had suddenly changed the language of the room. "What is that?" he asked. Rebecca returned to her chair but left the binder exactly where she had placed it. "The Whitmore Family Trust." Daniel looked at Margaret. "I have never heard of it." "That does not mean it does not exist," Margaret said. Claire leaned forward. "Is this some kind of separate estate plan?" Rebecca opened the binder carefully. "It is the central estate and ownership structure Richard and Margaret established years ago and later amended as their assets changed." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Margaret established it too?" Rebecca turned several pages. "Yes." Daniel immediately shook his head. "Dad never mentioned any of this to me." "Richard was not required to discuss every financial arrangement with you," Rebecca said. "Especially arrangements involving assets that were not yours." Daniel looked offended by the word. "I am his only son." "That makes you his son," Rebecca replied. "It does not automatically make you the owner of everything connected to his name." Margaret watched the confidence drain slowly from Daniel's face. She felt no satisfaction in it. This was not how she had wanted him to learn. Richard had always believed there would be time to explain the difference between inheritance and stewardship. Time had run out before that conversation happened. Rebecca turned the binder toward Daniel. "The will I read earlier governs property held personally by Richard at his death. Many of the assets you assumed were part of that probate estate were transferred into this trust years ago." Daniel glanced down at the pages. "Which assets?" Rebecca did not rush. "The Whitmore residence, several commercial properties, investment holdings, and a substantial ownership interest connected to Whitmore Manufacturing." Claire's face tightened. "Substantial meaning what?" Rebecca looked at her. "Enough that the assumption Daniel would simply take control of the company after Richard's death is incorrect." Daniel sat forward. "Wait. Dad was chairman." "Yes." "He voted the largest block. He exercised voting authority associated with trust-held interests under the governing documents." Daniel blinked. The distinction finally reached him. "So the shares were not all his personally?" "Correct." The room became very quiet. Daniel turned toward Margaret. "You knew I believed I was inheriting the company." "I knew your father told you that you would have a future in the company," Margaret said. "Those are not the same words. He said I would carry it forward. And you decided that meant ownership without conditions." Daniel looked back at Rebecca. "Who controls the trust now?" Rebecca closed one section of the binder with deliberate care. "We will get there." "No. I want to know now. And I need you to understand the structure first, because what you did this morning matters." Daniel glanced at the papers he had tried to make Margaret sign. For the first time, they no longer looked like a solution. They looked like evidence of an assumption. Rebecca continued. "Richard amended the trust 6 months ago. He was very specific about continuity, governance, and protection of the surviving spouse." Daniel looked sharply at Margaret. 6 months ago? Margaret remembered that afternoon clearly. Richard had been sitting in their sunroom beneath a faded Ohio State blanket, reading every page slowly despite his exhaustion. He had stopped before signing and asked Margaret whether protecting Daniel from his own impatience might someday be mistaken for punishing him. Margaret had told him their son would understand. Richard had smiled sadly and said, "Then I hope these pages never need to protect you from him." She had hated the sentence then. She hated it more now. "Did you convince him to change something?" Daniel asked. Margaret's expression hardened. "Be careful. I am asking a question." "No," she said quietly. "You are searching for someone to blame because the future is not unfolding exactly as you imagined." Claire placed a hand on Daniel's sleeve. "Maybe we should just hear Rebecca out." This time, Daniel did not pull away or argue. Rebecca turned deeper into the binder. "Richard did not disinherit you. In fact, he provided generously for you. But he separated financial benefit from control. He believed control had to be earned through judgment, responsibility, and respect for the obligations attached to these assets. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. So this is a test from beyond the grave? No, Rebecca said. It is governance. She pulled a marked document from the binder and placed it on top. And before we discuss your role, there is one fact you have misunderstood for most of your adult life. Daniel looked at the document, then at Margaret. Rebecca continued. Whitmore Manufacturing was never solely your father's achievement. The original capitalization records show that the money which kept the business alive during its first major crisis came from property belonging exclusively to your mother. Daniel's face went still. Margaret said nothing. Rebecca turned to another page. And that was only the beginning. Rebecca turned the next page and placed her index finger beside a faded signature dated more than 3 decades earlier. This is the original capital contribution agreement. Daniel leaned closer despite himself. Rebecca continued. Your mother sold 12 acres of property she inherited from her parents. The proceeds were invested directly into the business when Whitmore Manufacturing was facing a severe cash shortage. Daniel looked at Margaret. How much? Enough, Margaret said quietly. Rebecca answered more precisely. At the time, it was enough to cover payroll, supplier obligations, and operating expenses while Richard pursued the contract that eventually stabilized the company. Claire stared at Margaret with a new expression, one stripped of the polite distance she had carried into the room. Daniel shook his head. That still does not make her a founder. Rebecca turned another page. Then perhaps this will. She placed a second document beside the first. Margaret was formally recognized as a co-founder when the company reorganized. She later transferred portions of her ownership into the family trust as part of a long-term succession plan. Daniel's face went blank. Co-founder? Margaret looked at him. Your father wanted my name beside his on the building. I told him no. Why? Because I did not need strangers to know what we had built together. Daniel stared at her as though meeting someone he had known his entire life and never actually seen. Rebecca continued. Margaret also served as treasurer during the company's early years, participated in major financing decisions, and retained ownership rights even after she stepped away from daily operations. Daniel looked down at the documents. Why did nobody tell me? Margaret's answer came without anger. Because you never asked. The words landed softly, but Daniel had no defense against them. He had asked his father about revenue, expansion, acquisitions, and succession. He had asked Margaret whether dinner would be ready when he visited. He had asked her where Richard kept old photographs and whether she remembered passwords to household accounts. He had never once asked what she had contributed before success made everything look inevitable. Rebecca returned to the red binder. Now we come to the current trust structure. Daniel swallowed. Claire sat completely still. Rebecca turned to a tab marked Governance and laid the document flat. Upon Richard's death, his authority as acting co-trustee ended. Under the amended agreement, the successor controlling trustee assumes primary authority over trust-held assets, subject to the fiduciary requirements described here. Daniel's voice was quieter now. Who is the successor? Rebecca did not look at Margaret when she answered. She did not need to. Margaret Whitmore. Daniel stared at his mother. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. This one did not contain uncertainty. It contained understanding. You control the trust? He asked. Margaret folded her hands. I have responsibilities under it. That is not what I asked. Then yes. Claire leaned forward. Does that include the house? Rebecca answered. The residence is trust property. Margaret has authority over its administration and also holds protected occupancy rights. Daniel had no authority to demand that she surrender those rights this morning. Daniel looked at the papers he had pushed toward his mother again and again. And the company? Rebecca turned one final page. The trust holds the largest voting interest associated with Whitmore Manufacturing. Margaret, as controlling trustee, exercises that authority according to the trust and corporate governance documents. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. Less than an hour earlier, he had been planning a board meeting as though his promotion were a formality. Now the woman he had described as merely benefiting from his father's success held the voting authority he thought would become his. Margaret watched the realization move across his face. She took no pleasure in it. "Dad would never put you in charge of everything," Daniel finally said. Margaret's expression remained steady. "Your father did not put me in charge because I was his wife." Rebecca spoke before Daniel could respond. He confirmed Margaret's authority because much of this structure originated with assets and ownership interests she already possessed, and because both of them designed the succession plan together. Daniel turned toward Margaret. "So you knew all morning that I could not make you leave?" "Yes. And you let me keep talking." Margaret's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I was hoping you would stop on your own." Daniel looked away. For the first time that morning, shame appeared where certainty had been. Claire released a slow breath. "What happens to Daniel's position now?" she asked. Rebecca did not answer immediately. She reached deeper into the binder and removed a document marked with Richard's signature from 6 months earlier. "That," she said, placing it between them, "depends on something Daniel did before this binder was ever opened." Daniel's eyes moved toward the unsigned occupancy release. Rebecca followed his gaze. Richard anticipated the possibility that someone might pressure Margaret to surrender rights protected by the trust. Daniel went pale. Margaret closed her eyes for one brief second. The first revelation had shown Daniel who his mother truly was. The document now resting on the table was about to show him what his own choices had cost. Rebecca turned the document so Daniel could read the heading. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, slower the second time. "What does this actually mean?" he asked. The confidence that had carried him into the office was gone. Rebecca folded her hands. "It means Richard created safeguards around the trust. Any beneficiary seeking greater management authority must demonstrate sound judgment and respect the rights of the surviving spouse. Attempts to pressure, mislead, or improperly induce Margaret to surrender protected trust rights can trigger a formal governance review." Claire looked at the unsigned papers. "You mean these?" "Potentially," Rebecca said. "The documents themselves are not the only issue. The circumstances surrounding them matter." Daniel pushed them away as if distance could change what had happened. "I did not force anyone to do anything." Margaret refused repeatedly, Rebecca replied. "You continued pressing her. You represented the sale of the house as though you already had authority over it. Then you connected her refusal to whether you would continue treating her as family." Daniel's face tightened. That was an argument between a mother and her son. It became relevant to the trust when the argument concerned surrendering trust-protected rights. Claire turned toward Daniel. "Did you have anyone review those papers before today?" He hesitated. "I had them prepared." Rebecca's expression sharpened. "By whom?" "A real estate attorney I know." "Did you tell that attorney the residence was held by the Whitmore Family Trust?" Daniel said nothing. Rebecca already had her answer. Margaret watched her son stare at the table. Only an hour earlier, he had spoken about the house as if choosing a listing price were his greatest problem. Now he was learning that ownership carried obligations he had never bothered to understand. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. Rebecca tapped the document gently. "A review. Your current employment does not disappear because of one family dispute, and the personal inheritance provided under Richard's will remains governed by those documents. But the expanded management authority you expected is not automatic. The board and trustee must evaluate whether granting you additional control would serve the company and the trust." Daniel looked at Margaret. "The trustee," he repeated. "Meaning Mom." "Meaning Margaret, acting under fiduciary duties," Rebecca corrected. Claire's voice became careful. "So Margaret can stop Daniel from taking over the company?" "Margaret cannot simply do whatever she wants because she is angry. That is not how fiduciary authority works. But Daniel also cannot inherit operational control merely because he expected it. Daniel leaned back, stunned. Dad set me up. Margaret's eyes lifted immediately. No, he knew this could happen. He knew you. The words were quiet. Daniel looked wounded. Margaret continued before he could answer. He knew your strengths. He knew your impatience. He knew how badly you wanted his approval. And toward the end, he worried you had started confusing his approval with permission to own everything he touched. Daniel looked away. You could have told me. Would you have listened this morning? Margaret asked. He opened his mouth, then stopped. The answer was sitting between them in the form of unsigned papers. Rebecca turned to another section. There is more. Richard left instructions that if a governance review became necessary, Daniel would retain his existing role while the review was conducted, but he would not receive the executive authority he expected until the process was completed. Claire blinked. How long does that take? As long as necessary to evaluate the relevant conduct and corporate requirements. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. So I stay exactly where I am while Mom decides whether I deserve a promotion. Margaret's expression changed. You still think this is about a promotion? What else is it about? Character. The word stopped him. Margaret leaned forward slightly. Your father did not spend 38 years building a company so that our son could inherit a title without understanding responsibility. And I did not sell what my parents left me, work nights beside him, and protect that business through difficult years so you could walk into a room 3 days after his funeral and treat me like an obstacle. Daniel lowered his eyes. Claire sat motionless beside him. What are you going to do? He finally asked. Margaret looked at Rebecca, then at the red binder, then back at her son. She could hear Richard's voice in her memory, gentle and tired, telling her that consequences were not the same thing as cruelty. I am going to follow the trust, she said. Daniel swallowed. And me? Margaret's voice remained steady. You will keep what your father truly gave you. I will not take your inheritance because you hurt me. But I will not hand you control simply because you expected me to step aside. Daniel stared at her. For the first time all morning, he had no argument ready. Margaret reached for the unsigned occupancy release and placed it directly on top of the governance document. You wanted me to make a decision today, she said. Now I have. Daniel looked at the two documents stacked together and finally seemed to understand that nothing in the room could be pushed back into the shape it had been an hour earlier. The house was not waiting for him. The company was not waiting for him. His mother was not waiting for permission to remain part of a life she had helped build. Claire slowly removed her hand from the table. Margaret, she said, we should not have handled this way. Daniel glanced at his wife, surprised by the admission. Margaret did not respond immediately. She gathered the papers Daniel had brought and aligned their edges with quiet precision. No, she said. You should not have. Daniel leaned forward. Mom, I was angry. You were certain. I thought Dad wanted me to take responsibility. Responsibility does not begin by removing everyone who stands between you and what you want. Daniel lowered his eyes. Rebecca remained silent. There was nothing left for a lawyer to explain. This part belonged to a mother and her son. What do you want me to say? Daniel asked. Margaret studied him. Nothing today. His head lifted. Nothing? An apology offered because you are afraid of losing authority is not the apology I want. The words were gentle, which somehow made them heavier. I want you to go home and remember who you were before you started measuring family and property, titles, and voting shares. Daniel swallowed. You think I only care about money? I think grief revealed something in you that your father had already begun to see. Margaret paused. What you do with that truth is your decision. Claire looked toward Rebecca. And the review? Rebecca answered calmly. It will proceed according to the trust and corporate governance documents. Daniel will retain his current position while the appropriate parties evaluate future authority. Daniel gave a small nod. The fight had left his voice. So I still have a job. Margaret looked at him. Your father did not want to destroy your future. Neither do I. Even after what I said? Margaret's face softened, but only slightly. You are my son. That does not mean your choices are free of consequences. Daniel looked toward the window. Columbus moved beyond the glass as if nothing important had happened. Cars crossed intersections. People carried coffee along the sidewalk. Somewhere, Whitmore manufacturing employees were working through an ordinary morning, unaware that the future of the company had just changed inside a quiet conference room. Margaret reached into her purse and removed a brass house key. Daniel recognized it immediately. It was the spare key to the Whitmore home, the one Richard had given him years ago. Daniel had returned it that morning when he told Margaret the locks would eventually need to be changed before the property was listed. She placed the key on top of the unsigned occupancy release. You brought this back because you thought the house was becoming yours, she said. Daniel stared at it. I was wrong. Yes. Margaret stood. Claire rose halfway from her chair, uncertain whether to approach her, then stopped. Margaret buttoned her cardigan and picked up Richard's personal papers Rebecca had prepared for her. The red binder remained on the table. Daniel looked at it, then at his mother. Did Dad really think I would do something like this? Margaret paused. Your father hoped you would not. That is not what I asked. She looked at him with the same patient eyes that had watched him take his first steps, leave for college, marry Claire, and walk into his first day at Whitmore Manufacturing. He believed power reveals what a person values when nobody is there to tell them no. Daniel's face fell. Margaret continued. He did not write those protections because he stopped loving you. He wrote them because he loved what we built, and because he loved you enough not to confuse inheritance with readiness. Daniel nodded slowly. Can I fix this? Margaret considered the question. Not with me today. His eyes dropped. Then how? Start at the company. Go back tomorrow with the title you actually have. Listen to people who know things you do not. Earn their trust instead of expecting their obedience. And when you understand why your father valued stewardship more than ownership, then come talk to me. Daniel looked at the key. And the house? Margaret allowed herself the faintest smile. I am going home. She turned toward Rebecca, thanked her, then moved toward the door. Daniel called after her. Mom. Margaret stopped but did not turn immediately. I am sorry. This time there was no argument attached to the words. No request. No condition. Margaret looked back at him. I hope someday you understand exactly what you are sorry for. Then she opened the door. Before leaving, she glanced once at the red binder sitting between her son and the future he had assumed was guaranteed. You tried to remove me from a family I helped build, she said. I will not remove you, Daniel. But I will no longer protect you from the consequences of the man you choose to become. Margaret walked out without raising her voice. Behind her, Daniel remained seated before the papers he had brought to take away his mother's home, finally understanding that the most valuable thing his father had left him was not a company, a house, or an inheritance. It was one final chance to become worthy of them.